Legends, lore, and myths are a large part of nearly any historical event. For the events of November 29, there was no exception. Some of these stories were regarding parties, drinking, drugs, and a heated council of war on the morning of November 30th before the advance to Franklin. As noted by even the private soldiers in the ranks of the Confederate Army on the morning of November 30th, someone had to have blundered. They were certain that they had the Federal Army bagged, when the realization that the great opportunity had passed and the entire Federal Army had escaped, someone had to be responsible. So where and when did these myths originate? Some of them began that very day. Some can be substantiated to a degree, while others have little or no foundation at all. One of the stories has its foundation rooted in an event that took place on May 7, 1863, a year and a half before the battle at Spring Hill. On that date, a famous general was killed at Ferguson Hall, home of Martin Cheers, the antebellum structure that sits astride Columbia Pike in front of the current Children's Home. Major General Earl Van Dorn had been assassinated by Dr. George Peters for allegedly having especially close relations with the doctor's wife, Mrs. Jessie Peters. Mrs. Peters was 25 years her husband's junior and described as attractive of form and feature and fascinating of manner. When the general was killed, it became major news both north and south, not only regarding the general but the notoriety of Mrs. Peters. Some historians have suggested that Mrs. Peters had a dinner party that night and entertained some of the high-ranking officers, resulting in them neglecting their duties while the enemy marched by on the pike. This lore comes from Confederate veterans that were still searching for answers in the late 19th century in order to come to terms with that incomprehensible event. The reality is, however, that there has never been any evidence to suggest such an event taking place. This was one conclusion in the mind of at least some of the soldiers. Other historians have related stories of the possibility that General Hood was taking laudanum, an opiate that was once used freely as a pain reliever. General Hood was reportedly in the saddle the majority of the day, and it's been asserted that he likely was in pain due to the short stump from the amputation of his right leg over a year earlier. They argued that this might explain his sluggishness and lack of action on the night in question. However, no evidence has ever surfaced that could confirm his use of this drug after January of 1864. In light of the lack of evidence, this myth also falls to the wayside. Another of the most common myths regarding the inaction at Spring Hill was that the generals were drinking heavily. In the days after the fight at Franklin, it was reported in northern newspapers that rebel prisoners, when questioned about the event at Spring Hill, stated that General Cheatham was drunk. Cheatham was the easiest to pin this accusation on. His corps was in the lead that day, and he was the highest-ranking officer present at the front. Additionally, he had a reputation as a rough and rowdy man. Certainly, drunkenness would be the easiest explanation for the inaction that night. But Cheatham was in the presence of Governor Isham Harris, General Bate, General Chalmers, General Brown, and even General Hood that day and evening. Certainly, the commanding general would have mentioned this accusation in his later autobiography, Advance and Retreat, but he did not. Just one of the aforementioned generals could have corroborated such a story, but none did, most likely as it was untrue. In fact, his former inspector general directly addressed the accusation later, saying that he never saw him more self-possessed than on that afternoon. He gave his orders in a very plain and explicit manner. His words expressed just what he wanted, and in such a manner that no doubtful construction could be given them. He added that he was with General Cheatham when he was giving his orders to General Brown, and the charge that he was intoxicated is false. Cheatham was not alone with the accusations of intoxication. Judge J. P. Young studied the event at Spring Hill for many years in the late 19th century. He had concluded that General John C. Brown was in fact drunk at Spring Hill, and his intoxication resulted in the failure there. This conclusion was based on speculation and rumor that since Brown was from Pulaski, many friends had visited him while in the vicinity of Columbia and bestowed a large amount of apple brandy to the general, and that he had overindulged in liquor in front of Spring Hill. Perhaps the general was given brandy by friends and neighbors at Columbia, but the charge that he was drunk could also be dispelled by numerous figures that were in his presence that evening. General Cheatham, Governor Isham Harris, and numerous couriers that could have reported such to General Hood never did such. Thus the myth falls apart as well. In fact, it was General Brown who did threaten the arrest of two of his own staff officers that had overindulged late that afternoon. It's likely that historians that have ran with the allegations that the generals were drinking attribute much of these to the account of John Solomon Gregory. Gregory was a bachelor all his life and was from Columbia. According to him, he served as General Hood's guide on the march to Spring Hill and was in his presence the majority of the day. He stated that at Hood's headquarters, there had been much drinking and hilarity among the officers between darkness and midnight. He stated that Governor Harris nor Hood had been drinking, or if they had, they showed no effects of it. He also stated that General Cheatham was much under the influence of spirits. Walthall, Claiborne, and Granbury had also been toasting rather freely, but were not drunk at all. The problem with Gregory's account is that neither Generals Claiborne, Walthall, or Granbury ever went to Oaklawn that evening, the location of Hood's headquarters. Cheatham did go to that location, but returned to his own field headquarters shortly after darkness. Although no reliable evidence can be found that the commanders on the field were drinking, there is ample evidence that some staff officers had been drinking. It may be that when verbal orders were given, the orders were delivered in a different tone or meaning altogether. Regardless, none of the commanders ever noted or wrote about any of their peers being under the influence. Lastly, there's the famous breakfast meeting at Rippavilla on the morning of November 30th. Historians have alleged that it was here that General Hood dressed down his subordinates in language not suitable for ladies. But after deep research, not one single account of this meeting has been located or mentioned by any of the main actors. General Hood may have in fact visited the home and got breakfast there. He may have in fact raised his voice and indicated his displeasure with some of his subordinates, but he probably was not in the presence of his corps commanders, as historians assert. He had already issued orders for General Stewart to take the advance to Franklin at daybreak, and Stewart's position was over 3 miles north of Rippavilla that morning. Hood never mentioned a meeting with his subordinates, which would certainly have given more credibility to his accusations in advance and retreat. Not one corps commander ever mentioned this meeting, and certainly would have made mention of it, if any of them had attended, to use in their defense or their own personal allegations. Perhaps at the heart of any myth or legend there is some truth. Hood did take laudanum early on for his amputation, which is fact, but no evidence exists that he was still taking the drug after January 64. Mrs. Jessie Peters was a hot commodity, perhaps, but allegations that she was at least partially responsible for any command failure completely lacks credibility. We know that some staff officers were drinking at Spring Hill, but no credible evidence of commanders being intoxicated can be found. Perhaps Hood did take breakfast at Rippavilla, as legend tells us, and did voice displeasure with his subordinates, but not in their presence. Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction, and while many look for an outrageous explanation, in the end perhaps it was simply destiny.